Welcome, traveler of time and thought. As the world quiets and the night deepens, you've arrived at a story that whispers through the sands of ancient Egypt. Tonight, we're going to explore a side of history that's rarely discussed: the intimate lives of one of the world's most mysterious civilizations. But first, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? What time are you watching this video? Now close your eyes, breathe in slowly, and let's begin. To truly understand how personal relationships worked in ancient Egypt, we must first let go of our modern ideas about what is private, awkward, or forbidden. For the ancient Egyptians, human connection was not something to be hidden. It was natural, essential, and even divine. It was seen as part of the world's balance, just like the cycles of the Nile or the rising of the sun. In their creation stories, this connection between beings wasn't just biological, it was cosmic. One of the oldest myths tells of the god Atum, who existed alone in the endless waters of chaos. From this silence, Atum brought the world into being through an act of deep personal transformation. From his very essence emerged the first divine forces: Shu, the air, and Tefnut, the moisture. This story wasn't whispered with shame. It was engraved on temple walls and passed on in sacred songs. It was creation through life force, not through violence. There was also Nut and Geb, the sky and the earth, two divine beings locked in a close and loving bond. Their connection was so strong that it threatened to stop time itself. So the sun god, Ra, separated them, lifting Nut high above as the heavens and pressing Geb below as the ground. Yet the myth tells us that each evening, as the sky darkened, the two would slowly reach toward each other again. Their meeting symbolized in the quiet moments of twilight. In this way, dusk became a sacred reminder of closeness returning, of balance being restored. The Egyptians believed that when people formed bonds, whether through affection, companionship, or shared moments, they were reflecting the harmony of the gods. There was no guilt in it, no secrecy. It was simply the natural order of things. Through such connection, the energy of the universe kept flowing, from gods to humans, and back again. And so, in the flickering light of an oil lamp beneath the stars above the Nile, a quiet moment shared between two souls wasn't just personal. It was part of something much older, much greater, a tradition shaped by the heavens themselves. In the heart of ancient Egyptian belief stood a story of devotion, loss, and restoration, the myth of Isis and Osiris. It was more than a tale. It was a foundation, a sacred narrative that shaped how the Egyptians understood loyalty, partnership, and the power of reunion. Osiris, the beloved king of the gods, was wise and just. His wife, Isis, was not only his queen, but his equal, a powerful goddess of magic, healing, and protection. Together, they ruled in harmony. But peace is rarely permanent in myth. Osiris's brother, Set, overcome by jealousy, plotted his downfall. Through trickery, he sealed Osiris in a coffin and cast him into the Nile. When Isis discovered the loss, she began a journey that would echo across time. Searching endlessly, following whispers, guided by memory and love. She found his body and brought him home. But Set struck again, this time tearing Osiris apart and scattering him across the land. And yet, Isis did not give up. Piece by piece, she gathered him. Across deserts, rivers, and hidden groves, she recovered what was lost. With care and ceremony, she reassembled him. And in a moment shrouded in mystery, with the help of sacred rites, Isis restored Osiris to life, if only for a while. From their union came Horus, the falcon-headed god who would carry on the legacy of justice and balance. To Egyptians, this story wasn't just about gods. It was a blueprint for love that endures, for care that goes beyond the physical, and for connections that transcend time. Isis's devotion wasn't seen as dramatic or emotional. It was sacred. It taught that what is broken can be made whole again, that what is scattered can be found, and that through ritual, remembrance, and will, even the most fragile bond can be stronger than death. This myth echoed in their temples, in songs sung at dusk, and in the hearts of those who believed that real closeness, the kind shaped by trust and memory, never truly disappears. For the ancient Egyptians, the world did not begin with war or chaos. It began with presence, with intention, with an act of union, not division. This idea lay at the heart of their myths, where creation was not a distant miracle, but something intimate and powerful. Atum, the first god to emerge from the endless waters of Nun, did not summon life with a command or a thunderbolt. Instead, he brought the world into being from within himself. He did not need tools or armies, only his own life force, shaped by thought and motion. From that single act came air and moisture, the breath and the dew, Shu and Tefnut. These two deities became the parents of the sky and the earth, and from their line, all of nature followed. This story wasn't told in whispers. It was carved into stone. It was spoken in temples, repeated in ceremonies, and etched in the walls of tombs. The Egyptians didn't shy away from the body. They revered it. They believed it held the same creative force that once shaped stars, rivers, and crops. The divine act of creation was, in many ways, a mirror of what people experienced in their own lives. Moments of closeness, of trust, of union. But while human connection was fleeting, the gods' actions shaped eternity. Creation wasn't a one-time event either. It was something that had to be renewed, again and again. Each sunrise, each new season, each flood of the Nile was a reminder that the universe still lived and breathed. And within the quiet gestures of daily life, Egyptians saw echoes of that first movement, that first spark, that sacred beginning. To them, forming a bond, whether between gods, people, or nature itself, was the most powerful act there was, because from connection came life, and through life, the cycle continued. In ancient Egypt, closeness between people was not only personal, it was spiritual. Moments of connection, especially between couples, were often seen as acts that mirrored the divine. Rather than being private or taboo, these experiences were sometimes incorporated into rituals, festivals, and religious life. One of the most significant celebrations was the Festival of the Beautiful Reunion, a sacred event held annually at the Great Temple of Luxor. During this time, the statue of the goddess Mut was carried in procession to meet her consort, Amun, in a symbolic journey of reunion. Crowds gathered, offerings were made, music echoed through the colonnades. And in that ceremonial union of divine figures, the people witnessed a sacred example of harmony, of two forces becoming one again. The Egyptians saw in this ritual not only the return of love, but the return of balance. They believed that for the land to be fertile, for the Nile to rise, and for the harvest to come, the gods themselves had to be in alignment. And what brought them together? Not violence, not struggle, but unity, respect, and care. This idea trickled into everyday life. Some households performed quiet offerings to household gods before sharing meals or important moments. Temples sometimes housed hymns that praised emotional and physical closeness as gifts from the divine. Even in funerary texts, expressions of partnership were seen as worthy of being remembered for eternity. The body, far from being sinful or distracting, was a vessel through which divine order could be felt. A symbol of beauty, of creation, of rhythm. Every heartbeat, every breath, every soft gesture could be seen as part of something larger. An ongoing echo of the first acts of harmony among the gods. To live a good life, in the Egyptian view, wasn't only about morality or duty. It was also about maintaining connection, with nature, with family, with ancestors, and with the divine. And through that connection, one could feel grounded, whole, eternal. While the myths of the gods filled temples with grandeur, the real rhythm of Egypt beat quietly in the mud brick homes of farmers, craftsmen, and traders. For the average Egyptian, relationships were not wrapped in mystery. They were part of daily life, simple, essential, and often tender. Most people married young. For women, this could be in their mid-teens. For men, a little later, once they could support a household. These unions weren't always formalized with ceremonies or grand declarations. In many cases, a couple simply began living together and were recognized as partners by their families and neighbors. Marriage in Egypt wasn't only a contract, it was a practical partnership. The wife managed the home, the weaving, the baking, and the children. The husband worked in the fields or in the markets. But both were expected to care for one another, to cooperate, and to share life's burdens and joys. Some ancient texts even include poetry written from husbands to wives, expressing admiration and gentle affection. One such line, written on a piece of pottery, reads, "She enters the room, and my heart soars. I cannot speak when she is near. My limbs forget how to move." These words weren't carved in gold. They were scribbled on clay, everyday feelings from everyday people. Even in modest homes, signs of closeness could be found. Small tokens exchanged between spouses, worn amulets believed to bring harmony, shared jars of oil used to soothe tired hands after work. These small acts, repeated daily, held as much meaning as any myth. And when hardships came, illness, famine, or grief, the strength of these partnerships became clear. There are records of husbands standing by their wives through long sickness, of women burying their partners with careful offerings, hoping to meet again in the field of reeds, the Egyptian vision of paradise. In these humble homes, without gold or temples, the values of respect, loyalty, and quiet closeness were lived out not as ideals, but as habits. Steady, silent, and strong. In the calm rhythm of life along the Nile, children grew up surrounded by family, ritual, and the natural flow of seasons. And like the floodwaters that returned each year, so too did the moment come when childhood gave way to something quieter, more reflective, a time of change, of awakening, and of new roles in the community. For young Egyptians, this transition from child to adult was not marked by dramatic rites of passage or strict ceremonies. It was a gradual unfolding, often shaped by observation, imitation, and the rhythms of daily life. As boys learned the skills of their fathers, fishing, farming, craftsmanship, and girls observed the domestic world of their mothers, both also came to understand relationships through stories, songs, and what they witnessed around them. By the time a girl reached her teenage years, she was often considered ready to begin a household of her own. Boys, who needed to establish some economic stability first, typically waited a few years longer. These were not decisions driven by law or doctrine, but by practicality, by when someone could build, cook, grow, and care. Among families, advice was shared softly. A grandmother's quiet wisdom, a mother's careful instructions, a father's protective gaze. Young people were encouraged to form respectful connections, to seek harmony, and to understand that affection was not a passing thrill, but a part of something lasting. Papyrus scrolls and fragments of letters suggest that parents wished for their children to find not only stability, but kindness. One father wrote to his daughter, "Choose one who is gentle, whose eyes do not look past you when you speak." It was a simple line, but one that captured a deep truth. That connection in the Egyptian world was rooted in presence. The temples taught that unity should reflect balance. The home echoed that lesson in everyday acts, in shared meals, in exchanged smiles, in the first hesitant moments of understanding between two young souls who saw the world beginning to shift around them. And so, The journey into adulthood was not something to be rushed or hidden. It was slow, patient, and quiet, like the Nile itself. In a civilization as advanced and observant as ancient Egypt, even the rhythms of family planning were approached with intention and care. While large families were often welcomed, children seen as a blessing and a source of continuity, there were also moments in life when a couple might choose to delay the arrival of a new child. And for that, the Egyptians turned to a blend of knowledge, nature, and belief. What we now call prevention was, for them, part medicine and part magic. The lines between science and ritual were blurred, and this was not seen as confusion, but as harmony. The physical world and the spiritual one were never far apart. Medical papyri, such as the Ebers Papyrus dating back over 3,500 years, describe a number of curious and sometimes startling methods. Ingredients like honey, ground acacia, and certain herbs were mixed together to form protective ointments. These substances, often combined with soft fibers or plant materials, were applied in specific ways believed to reduce the chances of conception. Some scholars today suggest that acacia, in particular, may have had natural properties that supported these beliefs. But alongside these physical methods, there were also charms. Small amulets worn discreetly beneath clothing, or spoken phrases repeated under the breath. Some women turned to the goddess Taweret, the protector of women and childbirth, asking not only for safe deliveries, but for time and space in between. It's important to remember that these practices were never just about control. They were about balance. Egyptians believed that timing mattered, that a child should be welcomed into a home, prepared to receive them, emotionally and spiritually. The decision to wait was not seen as selfish or unnatural. It was seen as wise. In quiet corners of homes, women gathered to share remedies, advice, and stories passed from one generation to the next. No scroll captured all of it. Much of this knowledge lived in whispers, in the hands of mothers and midwives who knew when to act and when to pause. And so, even in a world shaped by divine myths and eternal cycles, the people of Egypt made space for choice. Gently, privately, with both faith and thought. Long before novels and love letters, there were verses, soft lines etched into potsherds, painted on tomb walls, or murmured beneath the moonlight. In ancient Egypt, poetry was not reserved for rulers or scholars. It lived in markets, in gardens, in the private thoughts of ordinary people. And in these lines, one emotion appeared again and again: the deep, steady pull of affection. Egyptian love poetry wasn't loud. It didn't shout or demand. It spoke in images, in rhythms, in pauses. A lover might compare the sight of their beloved to the blossoming of a lotus. The sound of her footsteps might be likened to the wind through reeds. These weren't just metaphors. They were reflections of how beauty was seen and felt through nature. One poem, found on a simple piece of limestone, reads, "She is more beautiful than any flower. Her voice is a harp, her presence like a breeze on the river." Another says, "I passed her house again today. I didn't mean to, but my feet remembered." These are not the words of gods or priests. They are the quiet admissions of ordinary hearts. For the Egyptians, words were more than decoration. They were powerful. Spoken aloud, a poem became a kind of spell, a message to the one you longed for, or a way to hold someone close when they were far away. Some verses were shared between couples. Others were left in tombs, intended to echo through eternity. Music often accompanied these poems. Soft instruments, flutes, harps, hand drums, turned private verses into song. Young people might sing beneath windows. Friends might hum during gatherings. Through sound, emotions found breath. What makes these poems remarkable is not their complexity, but their sincerity. They speak not of conquest or possession, but of longing, admiration, and quiet joy. They remind us that even thousands of years ago, someone stood beneath the stars and felt the same flutter in their chest, the same warmth in their voice when speaking a beloved name. In those verses, in those songs, we hear the heartbeat of a people who knew that love, though gentle, is one of the oldest forces in the world, and perhaps the most enduring. While marriage formed the foundation of Egyptian society, bringing order, cooperation, and continuity, not all relationships followed formal paths. Along the quiet banks of the Nile, in the dusty alleyways of Thebes, and behind the shaded walls of family homes, there existed a quieter layer of connection. These were the bonds formed outside of official unions. Connections that may not have had the blessing of contracts, but carried emotion, attraction, and sometimes even conflict. The Egyptians did not frame these connections through harsh legal terms or moral absolutism. Instead, they viewed human desire as part of nature, unpredictable, complex, and deserving of understanding. When such relationships occurred outside marriage, they were sometimes tolerated, sometimes ignored, and only occasionally punished, depending on context, intention, and consequence. In many cases, if a man formed a bond with someone other than his wife, especially if he was of higher status, it was treated as a private matter. There were no strict religious laws forbidding this, no sweeping condemnations. What mattered most was discretion, balance, and the absence of harm. If a man continued to provide for his household and avoided scandal, little would be said. For women, the expectations were more layered. While elite women were expected to be loyal and guarded in reputation, among common folk, life was more fluid. In village settings, close companionship outside of marriage could exist, especially in times of widowhood, separation, or delayed marriage. These arrangements, while unofficial, were often known to neighbors and accepted with quiet tolerance. Some texts from the New Kingdom period hint at the pain such relationships could cause. In a letter found in Deir el-Medina, a woman writes, "He no longer visits. He smiles at her instead. I wait at the doorway, and he passes like I am air." The words speak of jealousy, of change, of quiet heartbreak. These are not legal documents. They are echoes of lived emotion. But not all connections outside of marriage were painful. In many cases, they were simple bonds, temporary, affectionate, and understood for what they were. In a society where love was rarely rigid and where the gods themselves were known for layered relationships, such closeness mirrored the very myths people grew up with. Yet consequences did exist. If a married woman's relationship outside her union led to public scandal or claims of impropriety, social consequences could follow. Inheritance rights might shift. Reputations could suffer. Still, even then, community judgment mattered more than official law. Ultimately, ancient Egypt did not enforce uniform morality. It observed, adapted, and allowed space for complexity. Human connection, in all its forms, was accepted as part of life's unpredictable nature. The goal was not perfection, but harmony. Not obedience, but balance. And so, in the stillness of the desert evening, where stars blinked above and voices softened behind closed doors, not every connection wore a title, but each one told a story of longing, risk, comfort, and the many ways humans reached for one another in the quiet spaces between duty and desire. In the bustling cities of ancient Egypt, from Memphis to Thebes to the sunlit harbor streets of Alexandria, one could find not only merchants and scribes, but also women whose companionship was exchanged for gifts, coin, or favor. They were known by many names. Some offered conversation, some ritual gestures, others something more personal. And while modern language might rush to label them with judgment, the world they inhabited was far more nuanced and far less scandalized. Prostitution in ancient Egypt was not criminalized. It wasn't pushed to the fringes of society in the way later cultures might treat it. Instead, it existed in a kind of quiet acceptance, neither celebrated nor condemned. In many cases, It was simply a part of urban life, a social layer that served specific needs in specific places: port districts, markets, festivals, and sometimes near temples, though not within them. Unlike in later historical periods, there is no clear record of organized brothels in the strict sense. Instead, companionship might be offered in homes, in taverns, or in discreet outdoor settings shielded by fabric or stone. Some women worked independently, setting their own terms. Others operated under the protection of tavern keepers or matron-like figures who watched over groups of women and offered shelter and negotiation. The motivations were often practical. For women without family, for widows, for those unable to marry, this form of livelihood could offer independence, protection, and income. While many worked in hardship, others found a degree of agency that was otherwise rare. They were not slaves. Many made choices, complex, imperfect choices, shaped by the realities around them. One ostracon, a piece of pottery with writing, records a complaint from a man who believed he had been overcharged by a woman he met near the Western Quay. His tone is not moralistic, but transactional, much like a disagreement with a merchant. In that single fragment, we see the dynamic laid bare: services offered, prices set, and interactions governed more by fairness than taboo. But not all records are cold or practical. Some poems hint at affection between companions and their regular clients. Others describe women of rare beauty and wit who became favorites among soldiers, scribes, or traveling traders. These women were known for their perfume, their painted eyes, and their laughter. Not only for what they offered, but for the space they created. A pause in the harshness of life, a soft place to speak and be heard. Still, the life was not without difficulty. Respectability was fragile, and such women were rarely mentioned in tombs or official histories. They stood in the margins, visible yet unnamed, admired by some, ignored by others. And though their names are lost to time, their presence was part of the social fabric. Egyptian society, ever practical, saw little value in moral panic. It focused more on balance, privacy, and discretion. If a woman caused no disruption, harmed no one, and fulfilled a role, she was left alone. And in that space, often overlooked by scrolls and stone, she lived, not as a myth or a warning, but as a person shaped by her time, her needs, and her choices. In the spiritual life of ancient Egypt, not all rituals were solemn, distant, or veiled in incense. Some were personal, intimate, not in the physical sense, but in emotional closeness, in gestures, words, and energy shared between priestesses, petitioners, and the gods themselves. And among the most mysterious of these practices were those connected to fertility, where life, birth, and continuity were honored through sacred rites led by women of the temple. These women were not companions in the worldly sense. They were not entertainers, nor were they part of everyday society's informal bonds. Instead, they were trained participants in symbolic acts meant to represent the cycle of creation, often referred to as chantresses or servants of the goddess. These women served in shrines dedicated to Hathor, Isis, or Mut, goddesses associated with life, nurturing, and the continuity of the world. Hathor, in particular, stood at the heart of such practices. She was the goddess of music, dance, beauty, and joy, but also of love, fertility, and rebirth. In her temples, women played the sistrum, a sacred rattle whose gentle rhythm was believed to please the gods and stir the earth to fruitfulness. The ringing of the sistrum, the fragrance of sacred oils, and the slow movement of dancers under the open sky were not performances. They were prayers in motion. During specific festivals, such as the Feast of Drunkenness, which honored Hathor and symbolized the reunion of gods and the awakening of joy, women of the temple would take part in symbolic acts of renewal. Through music, wine, and dance, they reenacted mythological moments when the divine returned to the world after chaos. These rites were believed to ensure the continued harmony of the cosmos and the fertility of the land. Some records speak of symbolic unions between the high priest and a female figure representing the goddess, a ritual reenactment of divine unity, not physical, but theatrical, spiritual. The woman might be adorned in linen, crowned with lotus petals, her gestures slow and ceremonial, her presence more archetype than individual. She did not belong to one man or moment. She stood as a vessel of the divine. Outside of the temples, such roles were viewed with respect and caution. These women held status, knowledge, and access to spaces others never entered. They were trained in music, healing, poetry, and liturgical recitation. They carried responsibility, not just to the gods, but to the people, who looked to them to maintain the balance between the seen and unseen worlds. And yet, their lives were not without solitude. Temple service required discipline, restriction, and often celibacy. Their bonds were with the sacred, not the social. While others built families, these women tended to the spiritual body of the nation. Their voices echoed through sanctuaries, their hands poured libations, and their eyes studied the stars, not in search of romance, but in service to rhythm, balance, and life itself. In today's world, their purpose may be hard to grasp, existing between roles, outside modern categories. But in their time, these women stood as bridges between heaven and earth, silence and song, longing and rebirth. Ancient Egypt was a land of layers. From the low mud-brick homes of farmers to the towering halls of pharaohs, life moved to different rhythms depending on one's place in society. But while food, clothing, and housing clearly reflected a person's class, so too did relationships. Who you could be with, and how openly, was shaped not just by desire, but by hierarchy, tradition, and duty. Among ordinary people, farmers, bakers, artisans, partnerships were often simple and practical. A couple might begin living together after an agreement between families, or simply once both felt ready. There were no formal marriage licenses, no state officials. Their unions were recognized by the community and sustained by shared work, mutual care, and common challenges. These couples rarely worried about titles or inheritance. Their focus was daily survival, raising children, and keeping the household whole. But as one climbed the social ladder, relationships became more complex. Scribes, who held administrative power and often worked closely with temples or noble houses, were expected to marry women of comparable standing. Their relationships were monitored more closely, especially if property or prestige were involved. A well-matched union could strengthen family ties, bring access to higher circles, or secure loyalty across generations. In the temple world, many priests and priestesses were expected to remain celibate during their periods of active service. This wasn't enforced by fear or punishment, but by the principle of ritual purity. Closeness outside sacred guidelines was seen as a disruption to divine focus. And yet, once released from service, many priests rejoined social life, some marrying late, others choosing quiet companionship in their later years. For members of the elite, governors, generals, high-ranking administrators, relationships were not only emotional matters, but political ones. Marriage could be a tool for alliance building. A daughter might be wed to the son of a military official to guarantee loyalty. A second wife might be taken to strengthen ties with a distant province. In such cases, personal affection might exist, but was rarely the deciding factor. And at the very top stood the pharaoh, god-king, lord of the two lands, and the most powerful figure in Egypt. His partnerships were symbolic as much as personal. The great royal wife, often his sister or close relative, played an essential ceremonial role, accompanying him at rituals, overseeing temple offerings, and representing balance between masculine and feminine forces. But the pharaoh could also have secondary wives and companions from noble or foreign families, used to secure diplomacy or produce heirs. Despite the formality of elite unions, the human emotions behind them still found expression. In tomb inscriptions, pharaohs sometimes praised their wives not only for their status, but for their kindness, beauty, or wisdom. One inscription in the tomb of Thutmose III mentions his queen as, "She who brings calm to my heart." Behind the gold and granite, affection still lived, but relationships across social classes were far more limited. A commoner could not simply form a bond with a noblewoman, and vice versa. Such connections, if they occurred, were kept hidden or ended quickly. Status was not just wealth, it was identity, and crossing its boundaries could mean shame or exclusion. And yet, love, in its many forms, has always found quiet spaces. A servant might carry a flower to the lady of the house. A scribe might write poems for a woman above his station. These moments, rarely recorded, existed in glances, shared silences, and the spaces between expectation and feeling. In Egypt, the structure of class defined the walls. But within them, people still found ways to reach each other. Behind the limestone walls of royal palaces, away from the city noise and the songs of field workers, unfolded a very different kind of life. One shaped not by seasons, but by ceremony. At the heart of it all stood the pharaoh, a man seen not only as a ruler, but as a living god, a bridge between heaven and earth. And just as his crown bore the symbols of power, so too did his relationships carry the weight of tradition, politics, and myth. The pharaoh's primary partner was the great royal wife, often a queen of noble or royal blood, sometimes even his own sister. This bond wasn't just romantic or familial. It was deeply symbolic. The queen represented divine harmony. She stood beside the king during festivals, purification rituals, and sacred reenactments. Her presence was essential for maintaining cosmic balance, echoing the union of gods like Isis and Osiris. But the king's private life extended far beyond a single companion. Within the palace complex, there existed a more secluded space, the royal harem. Far from the stereotypes imagined in later eras, the harem was not a place of indulgence or secrecy. It was a highly organized institution. It housed not only women, but also servants, tutors, nurses, musicians, and administrators. It functioned as a protected, structured community with its own rules, routines, and hierarchy. Women of the harem came from many places. Some were daughters of Egyptian nobles, offered as a sign of loyalty or alliance. Others were foreign princesses, sent by neighboring kingdoms to secure peace or trade. A few were chosen for their talents in music, dance, or language. Entry into the harem was both an honor and a lifelong commitment. For many, it meant leaving their families, adopting court protocol, and dedicating themselves to a world of ritual, learning, and waiting. Their lives were not idle. Education was valued. Women studied poetry, religion, etiquette, and the arts. They performed during festivals and learned to walk, speak, and even breathe with royal grace. Yet despite the beauty of their surroundings, the gardens, the perfumed corridors, the painted ceilings, their freedom was limited. Movement was controlled, letters were monitored, and hopes of seeing the pharaoh rested on timing, favor, and fortune. Some women became favored companions, bearing royal children, receiving lands or titles, and being remembered in inscriptions and statues. Others lived in quiet anonymity, their stories never recorded. Jealousy, friendship, ambition, all played their part in the inner life of the harem, though much of it remained hidden behind walls and time. Still, it would be wrong to imagine these women only as passive figures. Some rose to remarkable power. Queen Taye, wife of Amenhotep III, was deeply involved in diplomacy and temple construction. Nefertiti, though her full role remains debated, appeared alongside the pharaoh as an equal in ritual and rule. And later, even Hatshepsut, born to a queen, would take the throne as pharaoh herself. In the royal world, relationships were not merely about affection. They were about lineage, divine order, and legacy. But within the patterns of protocol, human connection still stirred, quietly, subtly, beneath layers of ritual and gold. To serve in the palace was to live in a world of silence and splendor. Every word mattered. Every glance could shift fortunes. And every bond, whether remembered in stone or lost to time, shaped the rhythm of power behind the throne. Within the private boundaries of the royal residence, tucked away from the main courtyards and ceremonial halls, existed one of the most structured and misunderstood spaces in all of ancient Egypt, the harem. But unlike the images painted by later empires or romanticized by modern imagination, the Egyptian harem was not a place of excess or mystery. It was, in truth, a carefully managed institution, part school, part sanctuary, and part political engine. Known in inscriptions as the House of the Royal Women, the harem functioned as a protected space, designed to support the pharaoh's household and ensure stability within the royal lineage. It was surrounded by high walls, guarded not only by soldiers but by custom and ritual. And behind those walls lived not only the pharaoh's companions, but also their attendants, tutors, musicians, cooks, scribes, and officials. A micro-society, rich with routines and hierarchy. The women within the harem came from many different backgrounds. Some were native-born Egyptians from noble families, whose presence strengthened internal alliances. Others were foreign princesses, sent by neighboring kingdoms, Nubia, Syria, or the Levant, as part of diplomatic agreements. These women often brought their own customs, languages, and even servants, and thus the harem became a subtle hub of cultural exchange. Their days were structured around discipline and decorum. Young girls entering the palace received formal education. They learned sacred songs, practiced dance, recited prayers, and were trained in elegance and language. Reading and writing were encouraged among those destined for higher roles. But while art and music were integral, these were not merely decorative skills. They were tools for ceremony, for communication, and for maintaining harmony within a community where many voices lived in close quarters. Rivalry, of course, existed. With access to the pharaoh came influence, and with influence came favor, titles, and security for one's children. Women who bore sons, especially those viewed as strong, intelligent, or promising, could gain significant recognition. Some became favorite of the Lord, others were given estates or mentioned in stelae and tombs. But the path to favor was not one of open ambition. It required subtlety, patience, and an understanding of palace life's quiet language. Despite the walls, the harem was not a prison. It was a privilege and a responsibility. Many women had their own quarters, gardens, and attendants. Some participated in public religious festivals or temple processions. A few, like Queen Tiye or Nefertari, rose to immense prominence, respected not just for their connection to the king, but for their wisdom, political insight, and religious devotion. For others, life in the harem was quieter. Their names are lost to history. Their days spent in embroidery, study, conversation, or reflection. Yet their presence shaped dynasties, ensured continuity, and preserved the image of a harmonious, orderly kingdom. In the stillness of marble corridors, in the shade of date palms within private courtyards, these women lived their lives, not in fantasy, but in rhythm. They were not ornaments. They were keepers of lineage, daughters of diplomacy, teachers of etiquette, and sometimes mothers of kings. Though history may rarely speak their names, their silence was not empty. It was filled with meaning, duty, and the soft echo of footsteps within the palace, where every gesture mattered and every relationship carried the weight of legacy. Among the many layers of human connection that wove through ancient Egypt, there were those that existed outside of societal norms, yet were not condemned nor emphasized. These were bonds between individuals of the same gender, quiet, private, and often invisible in official records. And while the ancient Egyptians left behind temples, tombs, and texts that honored love and unity, They rarely labeled or categorized affection in rigid terms. Instead, they allowed space for feeling to exist without definition. Unlike in some later cultures, there were no sweeping prohibitions, laws, or declarations against same-gender relationships in Egypt. The concept of love or closeness was rarely forced into narrow categories. The focus was more often on harmony, propriety, and discretion, not gender. One of the most discussed examples comes from the tomb of Nyankakhnum and Khnumhotep, two high officials from the 5th dynasty, buried together in a shared tomb near Saqqara. Their names are linked in ways traditionally reserved for spouses, and their depictions show them embracing, touching noses, an intimate gesture in Egyptian art. While scholars still debate the exact nature of their relationship, whether brothers, close friends, or partners, the depth of their connection is undeniable. The tomb does not shy away from showing closeness. It honors it in full view. This example stands out because of its visibility, but it may not have been unique. Ancient Egyptian literature contains poems and songs that describe admiration between people of the same gender. In one tale, a god refers to another as "my beautiful companion, whose presence gives me light." In others, warriors are praised for their loyalty and closeness, not just in battle, but in spirit. Yet, these expressions were rarely explicit. Egyptians valued balance over extremes. As long as a person fulfilled their role in society, as a scribe, artisan, priest, or farmer, and did not disrupt the order of things, their private life was often left unexamined. There was no known legal system targeting such relationships, no temple laws forbidding them. What mattered was discretion, harmony, and continuity. It is possible, even likely, that many same-gender bonds went unrecorded simply because the culture did not demand that they be labeled. Friendship, affection, loyalty, and love all flowed together in the language of the time, sometimes blurring the lines that modern society draws so sharply. Among women, too, there were relationships of depth and care. In harems, in households, and among priestesses, close companionships were common. Some shared quarters, daily routines, music, and thoughts, while the written record is quieter here, as it so often is for women. The emotional richness of such bonds can be sensed in letters, in burial goods exchanged between female companions, and in the careful language used to describe loss when one passed away. The gods themselves did not offer strict instruction in these matters. Deities like Thoth, the god of wisdom, or Shu, god of the air, were often portrayed as neutral, representing balance, not rules. Even in myth, love and union were complex, sometimes tragic, sometimes transcendent, and always a part of divine experience. In ancient Egypt, where so much was sacred, the flood, the harvest, the stars, and the human form, the heart, too, was given space to speak. And though it may have spoken in softer tones when its language fell outside tradition, it was not silenced. It was simply understood. In the sun-warmed courts of Thebes and the quiet farms along the Nile, the Egyptian vision of masculinity was not rooted in domination or conquest. Rather, it grew from harmony, health, balance, and a deep connection to both body and mind. The ideal man was not the loudest nor the largest. He was the most composed. Strength, in the eyes of the Egyptians, came from restraint as much as it did from action. The image of the masculine figure was everywhere, in statues, on wall reliefs, in scrolls and ceremonial art. The pharaoh, for instance, was shown with broad shoulders, a narrow waist, and a calm expression. Not in rage, but in command. He stood still, holding the crook and flail not to strike, but to guide. Even the gods followed this form. Osiris, seated in quiet dignity. Horus, upright and watchful. Anubis, lithe and alert. Physical care was considered a sign of respect, not vanity. Men of status anointed themselves with oils scented with myrrh and frankincense. They shaved or styled their hair carefully, wore lined linen tunics, and adorned themselves with modest jewelry, a ring, a collar, perhaps a charm inscribed with a protective symbol. Cleanliness was not only personal, it was sacred. Purity of body was tied to purity of heart and mind. Among the common people, strength was expressed through ability. The farmer who turned the soil, the builder who lifted stone, the scribe whose hand never trembled. These were traits admired in poems and songs. One love poem describes a man not for his appearance, but for how he works with quiet hands and walks as if the wind listens to him. Another woman's words praise his silence more than others' speech. Masculine charm was often tied to composure. Impulsiveness was frowned upon. A man who could wait, who listened before speaking, and who kept his home in order was seen as dependable, and therefore desirable. Even in stories of passion or longing, the male figure often acts with calm intention. The gods themselves served as models for this balance. Active but thoughtful, powerful but patient. Potency, in the symbolic sense, was connected to fertility. Not just the fathering of children, but the ability to bring life to one's household, to protect, to provide. A fertile man was one whose fields bore fruit, whose animals thrived, whose children grew strong, and whose name would be remembered. These were spiritual and practical responsibilities, not merely physical ones. Medical texts like the Eber's Papyrus include remedies and instructions aimed at maintaining health and vitality in men, underscoring how closely well-being was tied to one's role in the home and society. But alongside herbal mixtures and wellness rituals stood prayers, appeals to gods such as Min, the deity associated with masculine strength, growth, and the cycles of the land. Min's statues, often striking in their symbolism, were not hidden away. They stood in public temples, celebrating natural forces, cycles of abundance, and the sacred rhythm of life. In his imagery, masculinity was not a threat. It was a promise, a reminder that from stillness comes strength, and from care comes creation. Ultimately, Egyptian masculinity was not about overpowering others. It was about sustaining the world, starting with one's family, one's field, and one's heart. And in a land where the sun rose like a god each morning and the river flowed like memory itself, being a man meant standing in quiet balance with all that moved around you, not above it, but within it. In the delicate lines of tomb paintings, in the gentle curve of statues, and in the verses of ancient poetry, we find a civilization that held beauty in the highest regard. But for the Egyptians, beauty was never superficial. It was a reflection of order, purity, and inner balance, an extension of harmony that began in the soul and blossomed through the body. The ideal female form, as depicted in wall reliefs and funerary art, was slender and poised, with a long neck, narrow waist, and graceful limbs. Women were shown with smooth skin the color of rich ochre, large expressive eyes outlined in black coal, and dark hair braided or styled in elegant waves. But these weren't rigid standards imposed by rulers or fashion. They were visual metaphors for life, youth, and health. Men, too, were portrayed with deliberate idealization. Athletic but not exaggerated, calm but alert. Broad-shouldered figures with strong arms and refined posture stood as symbols of both capability and restraint. A man's beauty, like a woman's, was not just in his features but in his movement, his care for appearance, and his ability to carry himself with quiet strength. Hygiene and grooming were essential aspects of daily life. Both men and women bathed regularly, often using natron salts or oils infused with herbs. Perfumed cones, made of animal fat and scented wax, were worn on the head during banquets, slowly melting and releasing fragrance as the evening progressed. These aromas were not only pleasant but spiritual, each oil associated with a protective or purifying quality. To smell of myrrh or lotus was to carry a divine signature. Cosmetics were more than decoration. Kohl, for instance, was used not only to highlight the eyes, but to protect them from the sun and ward off infection. Red ochre on lips and cheeks brought vitality to the face and was believed to enhance one's natural energy. Even the green malachite used around the eyes carried symbolic weight, tied to rebirth and protection through its association with the goddess Hathor. Clothing was designed to highlight the body without excess. Fine linen, sometimes nearly transparent, clung lightly to the skin and moved with the breeze. Women wore sheath dresses that accentuated the natural lines of their form, while men wore pleated kilts or tunics that allowed ease and symmetry. Jewelry, amulets, necklaces, bangles, was worn not only for beauty but for meaning. A blue scarab on a bracelet might represent rebirth. A lotus pendant might honor love, renewal, or the divine feminine. But beauty was not limited to appearance. It extended to sound. The tone of one's voice, the way a person laughed, or the manner in which they spoke to others. Elegance included posture, walking, even the pace of movement. A beautiful person in Egyptian thought was one whose presence brought peace, whose touch calmed, whose scent lingered, whose gaze remained gentle. It was a complete experience, visual, emotional, and even spiritual. Texts from the New Kingdom period include love poems that focus not on perfection, but on the sensory essence of a beloved. She passes and the breeze follows her. Her hair smells of sycamore blossoms. Her words are honey on the water. These are not exaggerated lines of conquest, but subtle tributes to presence. Even in death, beauty was preserved. Mummies were adorned with amulets, cosmetics, and jewelry. The body was treated with care, not to mask decay, but to maintain dignity. Beauty, in this context, was eternal, a bridge between the earthly and the divine, a way to meet the gods not with fear, but with grace. In ancient Egypt, to be beautiful was not to be envied. It was to be in balance, with nature, with the gods, and with oneself. It was a quiet elegance that asked for nothing but offered everything: warmth, harmony, and a glimpse of something greater than the eye could see. In the sun-drenched world of ancient Egypt, where the wind carried the scent of lotus fields and the earth breathed with the rhythm of the Nile, fragrance was more than a luxury. It was a language, a signal of presence, a silent invitation. The Egyptians believed that the way someone smelled was as important as the way they spoke or walked, and in many cases, it said even more. Perfumes were among the most prized substances in Egyptian life, from the simplest village homes to the grandest temple sanctuaries. Scented oils played a role in cleansing, healing, protection, and connection. Myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, cedarwood, and blue lotus were blended with animal fats or plant oils to create balms and ointments that could be rubbed into the skin, combed through the hair, or poured into small jars sealed with wax and linen. Women often wore scented cones atop their wigs or braided hair during festivals and banquets. As they walked, the warmth of the evening would gently melt the wax, releasing the aroma in slow, soft waves. This was not just for indulgence. It was a sacred act. The fragrance was meant to honor the gods, to signal purity, and to open the heart of those nearby. A woman wearing lotus oil was thought to echo Hathor herself, goddess of joy, love, and celebration. Skincare was another cornerstone of beauty and closeness. The dry Egyptian climate made it necessary to soften and protect the skin with rich creams and herbal salves. Olive oil infused with mint, crushed almonds mixed with honey, and milk baths with flower petals were common treatments. These preparations weren't limited to the elite. Even working-class families used what they could from local plants and minerals to care for their bodies. Smooth skin was seen as both attractive and healthful, a sign of vitality and balance. Kohl was carefully applied to the eyes, not only for protection against glare and insects, but to enhance expression. The dark line extended outward in graceful curves, mimicking the gaze of falcons and cats. creatures the Egyptians revered for their poise and mystery. The application itself was an intimate act, a moment of stillness before the mirror, a preparation for being seen and remembered. Color played a quiet but powerful role in attraction. Red ochre, used on lips and cheeks, brought warmth and energy to the face. Green malachite symbolized protection and serenity. Yellow tones reflected divine light. These pigments were ground on stone palettes, mixed with oils or resins, and stored in jars of alabaster, faience, or clay. Each tone, each scent, carried meaning. For lovers or partners, these details were not simply aesthetic. They were a shared experience. The scent of a favorite oil might linger on a linen garment, carried into memory long after a meeting. The smoothness of a hand, the shimmer of perfume on the collarbone, the quiet glow of scented skin beneath a canopy of stars, all were part of a sensory world that spoke of care, attention, and presence. Texts from the period mention how one's fragrance could define them more than their name. A man writes of his beloved, "Before I see her, I know her by the wind. She walks, and my thoughts follow. Her scent reaches me like the river in spring." In these words, we feel not only longing, but reverence, a reminder that beauty in Egypt was never rushed. It arrived like a breeze, soft, patient, and unforgettable. Even in death, the importance of scent remained. Bodies were embalmed with fragrant oils, wrapped with layers of linen steeped in myrrh, and buried with jars of perfume meant to accompany the soul into the afterlife. For the Egyptians, smell was eternal, the breath of the divine made tangible. In the quiet world of ancient Egypt, where the senses were trained to notice every sound, shadow, and flicker of light, scent became a thread between people, a secret signal, a silent embrace. And in that stillness, perfume spoke the language of closeness more clearly than words ever could. When walking through the ruins of ancient Egyptian temples or studying artifacts preserved in museums, one might occasionally come across a symbol that to modern eyes feels bold, even jarring. A stylized image of male anatomy carved into stone, painted on pottery, or molded into amulets. But to the ancient Egyptians, this image was not inappropriate or hidden. It was sacred. In Egyptian culture, the symbol of the male form, particularly its generative aspect, was not separated from the spiritual world. It was a sign of vitality, creation, and the unbroken cycle of life. Far from being shameful, it was revered as a source of power, a force that echoed through myth, medicine, and magic. One of the most profound examples comes from the myth of Osiris. After his brother Set dismembered him and scattered the pieces across Egypt, his devoted wife Isis searched the land, collecting every part of his body. According to legend, she could not find one piece, and so she crafted it anew with gold and prayer. This act, far from being taboo, was celebrated. It represented the triumph of restoration, the return of order, and the spark of new life. Their son Horus was born of this miracle, and with him, the royal line continued. In this myth, the generative organ becomes more than flesh. It becomes a symbol of continuity, the bridge between death and rebirth. It is not presented for shock or spectacle. It is honored, rebuilt, and immortalized. In temple rituals, certain festivals included references to this life-giving force. The god Min, often depicted in direct and unmistakable form, was the deity of fertility, agriculture, and masculine strength. His statues stood tall in public places, with offerings laid at his feet, lettuce, bread, incense, and carved symbols of growth. His image reminded people that abundance, whether in fields, families, or the flow of time, required energy, stability, and the favor of divine cycles. Amulets shaped in symbolic forms were carried for protection, healing, and strength. They were worn by both men and women, not as crude tokens, but as prayers in material form. To wear such a symbol close to the body was to ask for health, renewal, and protection in the unseen world. Midwives used them during childbirth. Farmers kept them on plows. Soldiers tucked them into their belts before going to war. Even architecture reflected these themes. Some obelisks, tall and slender with pointed tips, were associated with solar energy and creation. Though not overt in representation, their shape, rising toward the sky, grounded in the earth, spoke the same symbolic language. Life emerging, enduring, reaching for the divine. Importantly, the Egyptians did not divide the body into pure and impure, sacred and shameful. The entire form was worthy of respect. The generative aspects of the body were simply one part of a greater whole, deeply connected to health, magic, protection, and the rhythm of life. Modern perspectives may struggle with such imagery, but to understand ancient Egypt is to set aside modern taboos. In their world, symbolism was not designed to provoke. It was crafted to explain, to make visible the forces that shape their lives, from the soil beneath their feet to the stars above their temples. And in the quiet spaces where gods were called upon, where crops were planted, or where life was beginning anew, such symbols reminded the people of their place in the order of things, not as sinners or strangers to the body, but as caretakers of a living, breathing universe. To the ancient Egyptians, the human body was not simply a vessel for the soul. It was a landscape of power, balance, and healing. Each breath, movement, and heartbeat was connected not only to the rhythms of daily life, but to the broader pulse of the universe. Within this worldview, physical closeness, when approached with intention, care, and mutual respect, could be more than emotional or symbolic. It could be restorative. The temples of Egypt were filled not only with statues and prayers, but with healing rituals, many of which involved touch, scent, and energy. Priests trained in both spiritual practice and medical knowledge used chants, oils, and movements to rebalance the body and mind. These rituals weren't reserved for the sick alone. They were part of maintaining health and harmony, and they often involved the gentle laying of hands, rhythmic recitation, and the slow application of sacred ointments across the skin. In this context, closeness between healer and patient, or between companions, was not invasive or clinical. It was personal and sacred. The warmth of skin, the rhythm of breath, and the pulse of the body were all part of the healing process. Each element of the human form, from the temples of the head to the soles of the feet, was associated with specific deities and cosmic forces. To touch the body was to speak to the gods. Many of the remedies recorded in texts such as the Ebers and Edwin Smith papyri were based on the understanding that emotional and physical well-being were deeply linked. Anxiety, sadness, or grief could manifest in the body. And relief often came not only through herbs or minerals, but through the comfort of presence. A calm voice, a steady hand, a moment of shared stillness beneath a fig tree or beside the flowing Nile. Between partners, these principles were understood intuitively. To comfort one another through massage with fragrant oils, to recite calming verses while resting, to share warmth on a cool desert night. All of these acts were more than routine. They were ways of exchanging life force, of keeping each other balanced. Specific rituals were sometimes practiced to restore vitality. Couples might pray together to Hathor, the goddess of joy and rejuvenation, or offer incense to Min, asking for renewed strength and harmony. Healing was not something one waited for in crisis. It was cultivated daily, like tending to a garden. The goal was not perfection, but flow. Even the layout of homes and sleeping quarters reflected this philosophy. Beds were positioned to face favorable directions. Linens were chosen for their texture and cleanliness. Aromatic herbs were burned before rest to clear the air and mind. And in this carefully tended environment, the act of closeness, of lying beside someone, of sharing breath and warmth, became part of a nightly ritual of renewal. In funeral practices, these beliefs carried into the next life. The deceased were often buried with oils, with protective amulets for the body, and with inscriptions meant to remind the soul of the comfort and care it once received in the living world. Healing did not end with death. It transformed. To the Egyptians, the human body was a library of sacred energy, a place where emotion, intention, and spirit converged. And in moments of quiet connection, whether between companions, within families, or in the hands of a healer, they believed the life force could be restored, extended, and even deepened. Through harmony, through kindness, and through presence, healing was always possible. Not as a miracle, but as a way of living. In the ancient cities of Egypt, where the line between the visible and invisible was blurred by incense smoke and the whisper of prayers, magic was not illusion. It was order. It was structure in an unpredictable world, a force that moved quietly through temples, homes, and hearts. And among the most trusted tools in this system of meaning were amulets. Small objects, often made of stone, metal, or faience, charged with spiritual purpose. These amulets weren't simply ornaments. They were messages to the divine, shields against misfortune, and reminders of what mattered most. And in the realm of personal relationships, whether romantic, familial, or social, they played a subtle but powerful role. One of the most widely worn symbols was the ankh, often called the key of life. Worn close to the chest, it symbolized vitality, eternal presence, and the continuity of breath and being. Partners sometimes exchanged ankh-shaped pendants as a sign of lasting connection. To give an ankh was to say, "May your life be long, your presence full, and your energy unbroken." The Djed pillar, another powerful amulet, represented stability. In relationships, it symbolized emotional grounding, trust, and enduring support. Couples might place a Djed symbol above their doorway or beneath their bed, believing it would keep arguments from taking root and maintain mutual understanding. Stability, after all, was the seedbed of closeness. One of the more delicate and intimate charms was the knot of Isis, a looped symbol resembling tied fabric. This amulet was often worn by women to invite protection from the goddess Isis herself, who embodied loyalty, healing, and the strength of love that survives even death. When a woman gave this charm to someone she cared for, it was more than a gesture. It was a quiet vow. In addition to physical amulets, words themselves held power. Spells, incantations, and blessings were recited over the body, over beds, and even over shared meals. A softly spoken phrase before sleep, "May the gods shelter your dreams," carried the weight of a ritual. Many couples developed their own spoken patterns. Prayers adapted into personal codes, protective verses whispered at dawn, or short blessings written on potsherds and left by the bedside. Perfumed oils, too, were sometimes infused with magical meaning. An oil might be consecrated with the name of a deity, then gently rubbed into the hands or hair before a reunion with a loved one. It wasn't just fragrance. It was invocation, a calling down of calm, patience, or joy. Some amulets were made specifically for intimate harmony. One small charm found in a tomb near Luxor bore a tiny carving of two birds perched side by side, beaks nearly touching. On the underside, the inscription read, "We fly always in the same direction." It may seem simple, but in those 6 words, a lifetime of devotion was etched into stone. Even beyond partnerships, amulets were gifted between friends, from parents to children, or between travelers and those they left behind. They were small but meaningful, silent guardians of connection, strung on threads of linen or worn close to the heart. For the Egyptians, magic was not manipulation. It was maintenance, a way to keep life, love, and health in balance. And in a world where droughts could strike, where illness came without warning, and where the gods' attention had to be gently earned, these small acts of intention helped people feel less alone. To wear an amulet, to speak a verse, to place a charm beneath a pillow. These were not superstitions. They were forms of remembering. And in the quiet rhythm of daily life, they reminded each person that even in uncertainty, one could still protect, still connect, and still care, deeply and deliberately. When night fell over Egypt and the last flicker of lamplight was snuffed out, the world didn't go silent. It shifted. Beneath the canopy of stars and the watchful gaze of the moon, the Egyptians believed that the boundary between the seen and the unseen thinned, and dreams became more than idle imaginings. They were messages, windows into the soul, and often they carried truths about longing, love, and loss. Dreams in ancient Egypt were not random. They were deeply respected, recorded, and interpreted with care. In papyri preserved for thousands of years, like the famous Riverside dream book, dreams were listed alongside their possible meanings. If a man dreamed of drinking warm milk, it might be a sign of upcoming harmony in his household. If he dreamed of walking with a woman beside a river, it could mean the return of a former companion or a reconciliation yet to happen. In romantic contexts, dreams were taken especially seriously. A woman who dreamed of planting lotus flowers in the marsh might wake with the quiet hope of future affection. A man who dreamed of hearing music in an empty room might suspect that someone nearby was thinking of him, quietly, from a distance. These dreams weren't dismissed. They were retold over breakfast, recorded on ostraca, or brought to wise women and temple dream interpreters. Priests of certain temples, particularly those dedicated to Serapis or Thoth, the god of wisdom, practiced incubation, where they slept within the temple to receive divine visions. These dreams were sought during moments of doubt or desire, especially when guidance in love or marriage was needed. Pilgrims traveled far just to sleep one night on sacred stone, hoping for a sign. Among couples, dreams were often shared as a form of intimacy. A soft morning conversation might begin with the words, "You were in my dream last night." What followed could be teasing, reflection, or the quiet confirmation of something both had sensed, but not yet spoken aloud. To appear in someone's dream was to occupy their spirit, even if only briefly, and that, in itself, was meaningful. But not all dreams were hopeful. Some stirred unease. A partner seen turning away or walking into darkness could provoke anxiety or reflection. It was common to recite a protective charm upon waking, or to make a small offering to appease the gods and balance whatever energy had disturbed the night. In such moments, comfort came not from certainty, but from closeness. A hand held a little longer, a word spoken with care, a shared silence. Many Egyptians also kept dream tokens near their beds. Carved ivory wands with protective animals, scented stones believed to invite peaceful visions, or small amulets inscribed with hieroglyphs meaning safe passage through the night. These objects weren't meant to control the dream world, but to invite kindness within it. Poetry, too, spoke of dreams as gentle realms where the heart roamed free. One love poem reads, "I slept, but my heart stayed awake. It wandered to you as the owl flies low, unseen, but certain." In this single line, we feel the ache of distance and the beauty of invisible connection. For the Egyptians, sleep was not an escape from the world. It was another world entirely. A place where God sent messages, where the soul could explore, and where love often spoke its truest words. And when morning came, it was not uncommon to light incense, whisper a prayer of thanks, and carry that dream like a soft flame, glowing quietly behind the eyes. In a world so deeply attuned to balance, harmony, and ritual, the Egyptians held a careful awareness of boundaries, not only between life and death, gods and mortals, but also between people. And though they celebrated closeness, beauty, and unity, there were lines that could not easily be crossed. These lines were not always written into law, but they were woven into the structure of society, mythology, and cosmic order. One of the most complex examples was the topic of incest, particularly within royal families. While in common society such relationships were avoided, discouraged by both social expectation and practical wisdom, the pharaohs often acted differently. Among royalty, marriages between siblings, cousins, or close kin were not uncommon. These unions weren't born of secrecy or shame, but of symbolism. To the Egyptians, the pharaoh was more than a man. He was the living embodiment of the god Horus, and the bloodline of the gods, they believed, had to remain pure. Just as Isis and Osiris were siblings and divine partners, so too did royal children sometimes follow the mythic example. Marriage between a king and his sister reinforced the sacred model, ensuring that divine order remained unbroken. Such practices, however, were confined to the elite. Among the general population, the family unit was treated with care, and relationships that blurred generational or sibling lines were seen as dangerous, not only socially, but spiritually. A union that violated natural boundaries could, according to belief, disturb Ma'at, the divine principle of balance, and bring misfortune not only upon the individuals, but their household, even their descendants. Beyond bloodlines, other taboos existed, shaped by purity laws, temple guidelines, and ideas of moral danger. For instance, relationships between high-ranking temple servants and outsiders were tightly controlled. Certain priestesses, during their years of active ritual duty, were expected to remain apart from worldly connection. A breach of that boundary, especially within sacred spaces, could lead to ritual purification or removal from office. Even within accepted unions, there were lines of behavior that, if crossed, led to social or legal consequences. Adultery, while not always criminalized, could bring shame, damage reputations, and fracture family ties. In wealthier households, where inheritance and lineage were paramount, such acts might result in exclusion from wills or legal complaints. Among the working class, public shaming or separation was more common than formal punishment. But the impact could still be lasting. The concept of nebu, or impurity, extended beyond action to intention. A relationship formed in secrecy with hidden motives or manipulation could be considered spiritually unclean. In such cases, individuals might turn to protective amulets, purification rituals, or even temple confessionals. Not in the modern sense of confession, but as offerings to restore order and clarity. Yet even with these restrictions, the Egyptians did not dwell in fear. Their system was not built on guilt, but on alignment. If a line was crossed, it was not the end. It was an imbalance to be corrected. Through ritual, reflection, and change, one could return to harmony. The goal was not punishment, but restoration. What makes these boundaries so unique is how clearly they mirrored the mythological world. The same gods who created the cosmos through union also made mistakes, jealousy, rage, even violence. But through their stories came lessons: how to love wisely, how to recognize danger, and how to return to balance after straying from it. In the end, the Egyptians believed that the heart, the ib, seat of thought and emotion, was judged not by whom it loved, but by how. Was there respect? Was there truth? Was there awareness of order and consequence? These questions shaped every bond, allowed or forbidden, and guided each soul toward its rightful place in the unfolding design of the universe. Even in a civilization as tolerant and symboliczno-gnuczki as ancient Egypt, there were limits, moments when personal choices could disrupt not only relationships, but the very balance that Egyptians held sacred. And while the structure of punishment in Egypt was often practical rather than punitive, certain actions, especially in matters of loyalty, trust, and familial integrity, did provoke response. One of the most serious transgressions in the realm of relationships was adultery, particularly when it involved married women. While men were granted more leniency in extramarital behavior, so long as discretion was maintained and no social disruption followed, a woman's unfaithfulness, especially if it led to public knowledge or disputed lineage, could be seen as a violation not only of family order but of Ma'at, the cosmic balance. In such cases, the reaction varied depending on class, location, and circumstance. Among wealthier families, especially those with property, titles, or influence, the consequences were often legal and economic. A husband might divorce his wife, cut her out of inheritance, or even accuse her publicly in temple courts. Surviving legal texts show proceedings where women were denied claims to property or custody of children following accusations of disloyalty. Among the common classes, public exposure was a punishment in itself. Villages were tightly knit, and word traveled swiftly. Shame could result in isolation, severed support from the husband's family, or difficulty remarrying. Yet even here, not all ended in tragedy. Some couples reconciled, especially if the relationship had once been strong. Others quietly separated, with new bonds formed in time. In more severe cases, such as betrayal involving servants of temples, priests, or ritual specialists, consequences could be ritual or spiritual. A person might be banned from sacred festivals, subjected to purification rites, or removed from temple duties altogether. These acts were not just administrative. They were intended to reestablish spiritual cleanliness and prevent the disruption of divine service. For false accusations, the consequences could be equally serious. Ancient Egyptian law placed value on truth-telling, and a person who attempted to damage another's reputation unjustly could be fined, flogged, or denied the right to testify in the future. Justice was not one-sided. It was meant to maintain harmony on both sides of a conflict. Beyond public consequences, many Egyptians turned to the spiritual realm for resolution. Someone who felt betrayed might visit a healer priest, request the writing of a protective amulet, or even place a written curse, often poetic, not hateful, in a hidden place to encourage repentance. These acts were not acts of vengeance, but appeals for cosmic rebalancing. The belief was that if someone acted wrongly, Ma'at would eventually restore the proper order, gently or forcefully. Yet it is important to note that mercy and reconciliation were always possible. In many papyri, we find records of separated couples coming back together. A husband might forgive his wife. A woman might take back a wandering spouse. Relationships like the Nile could change course, sometimes drifting apart, sometimes returning with new purpose. In one surviving letter, a man writes to his former partner, "We have both walked in circles, and the sun has touched us both. Let us meet again, not in blame, but in balance." There is no record of her reply, but perhaps it was silence. Or perhaps it was a lantern lit in the window. The Egyptians understood that love and loyalty were fragile, and that mistakes, though serious, were also human. What mattered most was whether a person acted in awareness of their place within the larger pattern of life. If they did, forgiveness was not weakness. It was wisdom. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not an ending. It was a passage, a long journey toward the field of reeds, a peaceful reflection of earthly life where one could continue to eat, rest, love, and live in eternal balance. And for those who had known closeness in their earthly days, the hope of reuniting with the beloved in the afterlife was more than comfort. It was purpose. Within tombs, far from sunlight and the bustle of daily markets, the walls often spoke with quiet intensity. Painted scenes showed husbands and wives sitting side by side, holding hands, exchanging food and flowers. Their faces turned toward one another, not toward the viewer. These depictions weren't just art. They were wishes, prayers etched in mineral and memory, asking the gods to preserve the bond that had been formed in life. Some tomb inscriptions go beyond simple affection. They describe touch, joy, and laughter. One famous tomb near Saqqara contains the words, "She was the song of my evening, the light of my threshold. I wait to hear her voice again." In such lines, we hear not myth, but longing. A very human hope that love might remain unbroken by time or silence. Even burial goods reflected these desires. Couples were sometimes interred in shared chambers, their bodies aligned as they had lain in life. Between them, tokens of devotion, a favorite necklace, a shared cup, a love letter inscribed on a folded papyrus. In one tomb, archaeologists discovered two entwined figurines carved of ivory, placed carefully at the feet of the deceased. There was no label, no explanation, only the gesture. For unmarried individuals, or those whose partners had died long before, tomb texts might invoke a hoped-for meeting in the next world. A woman writes, "May I find him again beneath the sycamore tree. May we drink together as we once did, beneath stars and song." Death was not the end of affection. It was the space between moments. Temple hymns often included references to divine unions beyond death. The reunion of Osiris and Isis, the rebirth of their connection each year as the Nile rose and fell. Just as crops returned, so too would closeness return, in rhythm, in memory, in eternity. Some tombs of high officials, such as Nyankakhnum and Khnumhotep, show same-gender pairings portrayed with the same closeness as married couples. They are pictured face to face, noses touching, a gesture of intimacy in Egyptian art, and their joint tomb inscriptions speak of loyalty and shared life. Whether companions, brothers, or lovers, they chose to remain together in the afterlife, side by side. Even the objects buried with the dead carried personal traces. Jars still faintly scented with oils once used by the hand of a partner. Combs worn smooth with years of shared grooming. Cloth inscribed with protective prayers written in a familiar script. These weren't treasures. They were memories. For the Egyptians, what was once touched with care could not be forgotten. Closeness created a spiritual imprint. And if a person lived in balance, with kindness, attention, and love, they believed that the soul would carry those qualities into the next world. There, on cool evenings under flowering trees, they hoped to find one another again. Not as ghosts or shadows, but as themselves, whole and remembered. In this vision, intimacy did not vanish with the body. It lingered, in words, in scent, in stone, and waited patiently for its place in eternity. Within the golden halls of Egyptian temples, where incense drifted like morning mist and carved columns whispered ancient hymns, the gods were not distant or abstract. They were human-shaped, not in weakness, but in harmony. Their forms were full of grace, strength, stillness, and meaning. In a world where art was prayer and sculpture was language, the bodies of the gods became a canvas for everything the Egyptians believed about beauty, life, and balance. The gods were not portrayed with excessive power or fearful aggression. Instead, their figures embodied composure, purpose, and magnetism. The goddess Hathor, for example, protector of love, music, joy, and motherhood, was often shown with soft features, rounded contours, and a posture that welcomed rather than commanded. Her presence was meant to soothe, not intimidate. Her body represented abundance, fertility, and the comfort of affection. Osiris, lord of the underworld, was typically shown in wrapped form, his limbs bound like a mummy, yet his body still radiated dignity. His chest was wide, his posture erect, and his hands crossed with serenity. This was not a symbol of death, but of rebirth, of calm that came after transformation. His form invited reverence, not fear. Perhaps the most visually direct example was the god Min, associated with masculine vitality, agriculture, and generative force. His statues, often striking in their symbolism, stood tall in temples with clear, unmistakable references to strength and productivity. These were not vulgar or provocative depictions. They were devotional. Farmers would bring offerings to Min, not in embarrassment, but with hope for growth, harvest, and health. In his image, the body was not a source of shame, but a source of blessing. Isis, revered as healer, mother, and queen, was sculpted with a softness that conveyed both emotional and spiritual power. Her arms were often open, reaching or cradling. Her neck was long, her hands delicate, her gaze filled with knowing. The divine feminine, in her case, was expressed through gentleness and endurance, the kind of strength that restores rather than destroys. Even the temples themselves reflected these ideals. The curves of pillars, the positioning of statues, the play of shadow and sun on stone, all echoed the human form and its relationship to divine energy. The sacred was not high above the earth. It lived in posture, gesture, and breath. In depictions of divine union, symbolic, not literal, Egyptian art would often show gods and goddesses standing close, sharing offerings, leaning toward one another. These were not scenes of intimacy in a physical sense, but metaphors for cosmic connection. The moment of unity between two divine beings was a moment when creation renewed itself, when harmony triumphed over chaos. The sensuality of these forms was not about temptation. It was about rhythm. The Egyptians understood that the divine could be felt in every curve of a wrist, every angle of a shoulder, every moment of stillness before movement. Beauty was not decoration. It was instruction. It taught the eyes to see, the hands to respect, and the soul to remember. This embodiment of balance, strong but serene, grounded but radiant, became the model for humans as well. To care for one's body, to move with intention, to appear clean and composed, was not vanity. It was devotion, a way of echoing the divine in daily life. So when an ancient Egyptian stood before the statue of Hathor, or Min, or Isis, they were not worshiping an idol. They were remembering how to be whole, how to walk with grace, speak with meaning, and live in harmony with the rhythms that pulse through heaven and earth alike. In a land where gods walked among men and temples were as much centers of healing as they were of worship, the Egyptians held a unique understanding of the human body, one where medicine, emotion, and spirit flowed together like branches of the Nile. Their physicians were not only observers of illness, but interpreters of balance. And when it came to matters of affection, energy, and vitality, the ancient texts did not shy away. They recorded treatments, rituals, and insights into how love, both physical and emotional, touched every part of the body. Among the oldest and most detailed medical scrolls is the Ebers Papyrus, dating back to around 1550 BCE. Spanning over 100 pages, it includes remedies for everything from toothaches to digestive troubles, but also touches on emotional imbalance, fatigue and companionship, and the rhythms of partnership. Here, the heart was not merely an organ. It was the seat of thought, intention, and desire, the very center of human identity. If someone became distant or cold in a relationship, the condition might be described as a disturbance of the heart's flow. The recommended cure could include a mixture of honey, figs, and certain herbs believed to sweeten speech and open memory. This wasn't merely poetic. The Egyptians believed that emotions were real forces within the body, capable of becoming stuck, overheated, or drained, and that certain foods, scents, and rituals could restore their movement. Herbs like fenugreek, coriander, and blue lotus were used not just for flavor or fragrance, but for their warming and calming effects. Blue lotus, in particular, was often steeped into wine or applied as an oil, associated with relaxation, sensual dreaming, and the return of balance. It was offered in banquets, ceremonies, and moments of closeness, a flower that eased the body and opened the mind. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, one of the earliest texts focused on women's health, includes sections on emotional changes during different phases of life. While much of the language is practical, it acknowledges that attraction, longing, and emotional disconnect have physical symptoms, and that healing must involve the whole self. A person who had lost the joy of closeness might be treated with aromatic compresses, warm baths infused with floral oils, and listening to recitations of sacred poetry, slow, melodic verses designed to calm the body and stir memory. In such cases, healing was not rushed. It moved as gently as the floodwaters receding after harvest. These ancient doctors also spoke of the Ka, the vital essence that flowed through every living thing. When the Ka was strong, a person felt radiant, composed, and connected. When it weakened, due to grief, loneliness, or conflict, the skin lost its glow, the voice lost its warmth, and the will faded. Treatments focused on nourishing the Ka through connection, shared meals, physical closeness, and moments of peaceful silence. Even male vitality was addressed, not in a boastful or objectified way, but with care. Certain roots and minerals were believed to restore energy and courage. But more than that, healers emphasized emotional stability. A steady heart, they believed, produced a steady body. This blending of science and spirit is what made Egyptian medicine so unique. There was no divide between physical and emotional, no shame in seeking help for matters of the heart. A person struggling in love was seen as needing balance, not punishment or judgment. Today, these scrolls remain fragile but clear. Their ink has faded in places, their edges curled by centuries, but their message endures. That to care for the body is to care for the soul, and that love, in all its complexity, deserves attention, understanding, and gentleness. In the dry air of ancient Egypt, where the sun painted every stone with golden light and the breeze carried the whispers of the Nile, scent was not simply a luxury. It was a presence, a language, a way of reaching others without words, and of remembering those who were no longer near. Perfume, to the Egyptians, was not superficial. It was sacred. Its ingredients were carefully chosen, ground, distilled, and blended by hand, sometimes over weeks, to create oils and unguents that carried emotion as much as fragrance. These were not merely used to mask the body, but to express it, to offer warmth, clarity, calm, or closeness. Aromatic oils were central to daily life. Rubbed into the skin after bathing, offered to gods, and exchanged between lovers. The scent of frankincense meant renewal. Myrrh meant longing. Blue lotus, the flower of dreams, was associated with affection, sensual reflection, and the soft opening of the heart. Its sweet, faintly intoxicating aroma was believed to stimulate both mind and memory. In moments of connection, couples would often share oil from the same vial, massaging it into each other's hands, shoulders, or hair. This act wasn't only about fragrance, it was trust. It was attention. It was care made visible through gesture. And long after the moment passed, the scent might linger. On cloth, in the air, or within memory. Love poems from the era are filled with references to scent. One fragment reads, "She passed by, and my heart followed the scent she left. I turned to stone, and the air grew warm." Another says, "Your hair still holds the oil we shared. I smell it when the breeze moves through the reeds." In these words, we see that smell was not an accessory. It was a thread, linking people across time, space, and silence. Perfume was also a spiritual safeguard. Before temple rituals, both priests and participants would anoint themselves, not only to purify, but to align their inner being. The gods were said to favor sweet offerings and pleasing scents, and so to smell beautiful was to honor them and to declare oneself whole. In funerary customs, scents were essential. Bodies were wrapped in linen infused with cinnamon, cedarwood, and balsam. These were not only preservatives, they were love letters to eternity, a way of saying, this soul was cherished. Let the gods know it through fragrance. Some tombs still carry faint traces of these scents, trapped in stone for over 3,000 years. There were also practical uses: oils that softened the skin after days in the sun, salves that reduced inflammation or calmed nerves. But the line between healing and attraction was never strict. A balm given by a spouse might carry both tenderness and intention. Even the kohl eyeliner worn by both men and women often contained fragrant resins. As it protected the eyes from glare, it also signaled care for appearance, attention to presence. The same went for scented cones worn atop wigs during banquets, slowly melting with body heat, releasing waves of soft perfume throughout the night. And then there were the private moments. A woman leaving a scarf on a lover's cot, its fabric still carrying her perfume. A man returning from the fields, greeted not with words, but with the scent of almond oil in the crook of his partner's neck. These details weren't recorded in ledgers or scrolls, but they happened, quietly, softly, like incense curling in the air. For the ancient Egyptians, to love someone was not just to speak or to touch. It was to recognize their scent in a crowd, to carry it home with you, to miss it when it faded. And so they anointed, perfumed, inhaled, and remembered, trusting that even if time silenced voices and erased footprints, fragrance might remain. A trace of closeness, a breath of the beloved, a whisper of something once shared. Beyond the grandeur of temples and the carvings of myth, beyond the laws and scrolls, perfumes and poetry, there was the quiet heart of Egyptian life, the home. It might be a mud brick dwelling with 3 rooms, a courtyard, and a flat roof, or a larger household with servants, garden trees, and storage jars. But no matter the size, it was here, within thick walls and cool shadows, that love was most honestly lived. The ancient Egyptian home was both a shelter and a stage for emotion. During the day, it echoed with routine, grinding grain, preparing meals, fetching water from the river. But at dusk, as the sun sank behind the fields and lamplight flickered to life, something softer emerged. Couples would sit together on reed mats, share a bowl of dates or figs, or simply listen to the sounds of the village winding down. There were no grand declarations, only nearness, the kind that comes from daily partnership. Intimacy in such spaces wasn't defined by spectacle. It was woven into gesture. A hand resting on another's arm while talking. A shared blanket on a cold night. The passing of a comb or cloth with familiarity, not ceremony. These were the rituals of affection. Quiet, practical, sacred. In wealthier homes, couples might have more privacy. A curtained room, scented oil, music from a harp. But even in humbler settings, partners found their own rhythms. They rose together before dawn, whispered in half-sleep, helped one another dress. These moments weren't documented in papyri or painted on tomb walls, yet they formed the essence of connection. The home was also a space of vulnerability. Illness, grief, and fatigue visited every doorway. In such moments, the strength of a relationship was tested not by beauty, but by presence. One partner cooling the other's forehead. Quiet words when there was nothing to fix. These acts, unseen by gods or scribes, were the foundation of what the Egyptians called nehe, the everlasting. Not just eternity after death, but lastingness in life. Children, too, were born of these homes. Not always planned, not always perfect, but deeply welcomed. Fathers often took active roles in nurturing. Mothers, even while managing countless tasks, found ways to hum lullabies, to weave little charms of protection into their child's hair. Love expanded in circles, from lovers to family, from family to community. Household shrines held small statues of deities like Bez and Taweret, protectors of childbirth and intimacy. Offerings left at their feet, a flower, a splash of beer, a whispered request, show that even in private, love was honored. It needed guardianship. It needed gratitude. Some homes had simple drawings etched into walls. A lotus, a pair of doves, a sun rising between hills. Not elaborate, but meaningful. A reminder that beauty had a place indoors, not only in palaces. Even meals held emotional weight. To cook for someone was an act of devotion. To wait up for them, to leave a cup of water by their bed, to light the lamp before they came home. These were not chores. These were expressions of tenderness. And when arguments came, as they did, reconciliation mattered. Apologies were made not through speeches, but through gesture. Offering a favorite fig, braiding someone's hair, drawing water on their behalf. Forgiveness lived in action, not in words alone. In the Egyptian home, love was not always loud, but it was constant. It lived in dusted floors, in folded linen, in shadows cast by lamps on adobe walls. It lived in waiting, returning, trying again. And long after the lovers were gone, their home remained. Sometimes buried beneath new structures, sometimes reduced to outlines in the soil, but always, somewhere, the memory of warmth lingered. In silence, in scent, in the gentle hush of lives once shared. As we draw the final curtain on this quiet journey through the intimate lives of ancient Egyptians, we are left with more than stone and scroll. We are left with a feeling, soft, enduring, and deeply familiar. Because while the gods have faded into myth and the cities have crumbled into sand, the essence of closeness, of love in its many quiet forms, has never truly left us. In a world built on cycles of flood and drought, light and shadow, birth and death, the Egyptians found comfort in connection. They sought harmony not only with the divine, but with each other. Their poems speak of longing. Their medicine seeks to soothe the heart. Their tombs hold memories of warmth and partnership. And their art, in every line, every carved touch, remembers the body not as sin, but as home. We've walked through sacred bedrooms lit by oil lamps. We've listened to verses murmured under breath, watched as perfumes were offered not just to gods, but to loved ones. We've stood before the tombs of two men who chose to be buried side by side, and we've read the lines of women who called to their lovers across eternity. These weren't legends. They were lives. What stands out most is the stillness, the sense that in ancient Egypt, love did not need noise to be real. It lived in gesture, in memory, in things left behind. A folded cloth, a shared meal, a worn amulet tied with care. The kind of love that doesn't demand attention, only presence. Even now, thousands of years later, we recognize these signs. A hand placed gently on another's shoulder, a letter hidden under a pillow, a scent that suddenly reminds us of someone long gone. These are echoes, modern but ancient, fragile but eternal. And in this way, the people of ancient Egypt are not so far removed. They laughed, they touched, they hoped, they missed one another. They offered oils, music, food, and forgiveness. They lived in houses where love flickered like candlelight, quiet, warm, and real. Tonight, as you lie back in your own space, wherever you are in the world, you carry that same thread, that same quiet desire to be close, to be seen, to be remembered. And perhaps, just perhaps, part of the reason their stories still live is because we still understand them. Not through words alone, but through feeling. So rest now. Let the past settle around you like linen, soft and protective. Let the old voices fade into the night, not as strangers, but as companions on the long journey of the heart. Thank you for walking with me through the stillness, the scent, and the soul of a time gone by. And may your sleep tonight be as gentle as the waters of the Nile. Good night.